The air in the Everglades at night isn't just humid, it's a living, breathing thing, thick with the scent of cypress, decay, and the electric hum of a million unseen insects. Most people imagine Florida as sun-drenched beaches and theme parks. They don't see the real Florida, the ancient primordial heart beating in the swamp, where the darkness is absolute and something far older than humanity stirs beneath the surface. I've always found a twisted comfort here, a sense of belonging in the wild, but that comfort has been shattered, because out here, in the inky blackness, a whisper began. A whisper from the animal enclosures, a sound no animal could make, twisting the very strict rules we live by into something fatal. And now the rules aren't just for the animals, they're for me, they're for survival. My name is Alex, and for the past 3 years, the Arthurian Wildlife Sanctuary in the heart of the Florida Everglades has been my second home. Most people volunteer here because they love animals. I do too, of course. But there's also something about the raw, untamed nature of the glades that calls to me. It's a place where you feel small, insignificant, and yet intimately connected to something vast and eternal. During the day, it's a bustling hub of activity, guided tours, educational programs, the general upkeep of over 100 acres of diverse ecosystems. But at night, the sanctuary transforms. It becomes a different beast entirely, and that's when my real work begins. I'm part of the nocturnal observation team. We monitor the animals in their most active hours, check on their health, ensure security, and generally keep a watchful eye. It's demanding, often lonely work, but incredibly rewarding. The sounds of the night here are a symphony. The deep croak of bullfrogs, the rustle of alligators slithering through sawgrass, the distant cry of a great horned owl. These are the sounds of life, of a natural order. And for a long time, they were comforting. Our training for the nocturnal enclosures is extensive, rigorous, and frankly, terrifying. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the sanctuary director, a woman whose passion for conservation is matched only by her stoic demeanor and an almost unnerving intuition, drilled the rules into us from day one. These aren't zoo exhibits, she'd always say, her voice gravelly but firm. These are habitats designed to be as close to the wild as possible. And the wild, Alex, is unforgiving. It demands respect. It demands adherence to procedure. Deviate, and you don't just put yourself at risk, you endanger every living creature, human and animal, within these fences. The rules were indeed deadly serious. Rule number 1, never stray from the designated paths, which were always well lit by motion-activated floodlights. Rule number 2, never look directly into certain enclosures, particularly the older, more isolated ones at the far eastern edge of the sanctuary, where the panthers and larger predatory birds were housed. Dr. Vance never fully explained why, just a curt, "It's for their welfare and yours. Direct, prolonged eye contact can be perceived as aggression, and these animals are not pets." Rule number 3, always report anything unusual, no matter how minor. A fallen branch, a flickering light, a sound out of place. And the most important, the one etched into the very fabric of our being as night volunteers. Rule number 4, never, under any circumstances, ignore an alarm. Not a single one. Every alarm had to be investigated, immediately and without hesitation. I took pride in following these rules. They were the framework that allowed me to navigate the darkness, to feel safe in a place that could, at any moment, swallow you whole. My usual shift starts at dusk. I grab my thermal camera, my heavy-duty flashlight, my walkie-talkie, and a small first aid kit. The evening air is still warm, thick with the scent of decomposing leaves and wet earth. My route takes me past the rehabilitated alligators, their eyes glowing like embers in the beam of my light, then to the various bird enclosures, where the owls are just beginning to stir. Finally, I head towards the larger predator enclosures, a section of the sanctuary that feels distinctly more isolated, even ominous. It was Tuesday, a little over 3 weeks ago, when the first whisper began. I was performing a routine check of the Florida panther enclosure, a vast, dense habitat designed to mimic their natural hunting grounds. The panthers, a majestic pair named Midnight and Shadow, are usually elusive, preferring to stay hidden amongst the thick brush. My thermal camera typically picks up their body heat, a comforting orange glow in the otherwise cool blue of the screen. That night, everything seemed normal. The camera showed Midnight lounging on a high branch, her silhouette barely visible against the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy. Shadow was nowhere to be seen, which wasn't unusual. I moved along the perimeter fence, shining my flashlight briefly into the darker corners, listening to the familiar sounds. The crickets, the distant frogs. Then I heard it. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a hiss. It wasn't even a grunt. It was a sigh. A long, drawn-out exhalation, almost human in its quality, coming from inside the panther enclosure. My blood ran cold. I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight beam dancing nervously. Midnight was still on her branch, unmoving. Shadow, if he were close enough to make a sound like that, would have shown up on the thermal camera. But there was nothing. Just the deep, suffocating silence of the glades, suddenly devoid of its comforting symphony. I tried to rationalize it. A branch creaking, the wind, an echo. The Everglades plays tricks on your ears at night. Your mind too can fill in the blanks, especially when you're alone in the dark. I stood there for a full minute, listening intently, my heart thudding against my ribs. Nothing, just the regular mundane sounds of the swamp returning, slowly, hesitantly. I shook my head, convinced it was just my imagination, a consequence of long hours and an overactive mind. I finished my rounds, double-checked the locks and walked back to the staff quarters, the sound of that inexplicable sigh lingering at the edge of my consciousness. The next night, Wednesday, was worse. I tried to dismiss the previous night's incident as a fluke, a phantom sound. I told myself to focus, to stick to the routine, but the unease had set in, a subtle shift in the air, a microscopic crack in the foundation of my perceived safety. I started my rounds, acutely aware of every rustle, every shadow. As I approached the same panther enclosure, my hand instinctively tightened on my flashlight. The floodlights clicked on as I entered the zone, casting stark shadows. I swept my thermal camera across the habitat. Midnight was there again on her high branch, still no sign of shadow. And then I saw it. On the ground, near the thickest patch of cypress knees, where the shadows were deepest, was a small, cylindrical object. It was almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark earth, but the beam of my flashlight caught a glint, a subtle reflection. It shouldn't have been there. Nothing should have been there that wasn't part of the natural environment or a carefully monitored enrichment toy, and this was neither. My breath hitched, my mind raced through the possibilities. Had a visitor dropped something? Impossible. This enclosure was double-fenced with an electrified perimeter. No one could get in. Had a colleague somehow left it there during the day? Unlikely. We were meticulous about keeping the enclosures pristine and free of foreign objects. I hesitated, my hand hovering over my walkie-talkie. My instructions were clear. Report anything unusual. But what was it? A simple piece of litter, or something more? My curiosity, a dangerous trait in a place like this, won out over my better judgment. I crouched down, straining to see through the mesh, trying to make out what the object was. It was an old tarnished brass thimble. Not just any thimble, but one of those intricate antique ones, with tiny etchings around its base. It looked out of place, anachronistic, like something plucked from a forgotten attic and inexplicably dropped into a panther habitat in the middle of the Everglades. As I stared at it, a faint metallic clink echoed from deep within the enclosure. It was soft, barely audible, but distinct. It sounded like the thimble shifting. No, not shifting. Like it had been moved. Just as I processed this, a low guttural growl rippled through the enclosure. It wasn't Midnight. It was too deep, too resonant, too close. My thermal camera remained blank where shadow should have been. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at my skin. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light or sound. This was real, and it was happening inside the enclosure. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight beam wildly scanning the darkness. The thimble was still there, a tiny, innocuous object that had suddenly become the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the spot where the thimble lay. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible rustle in the dense undergrowth. It sounded like something large, something heavy, moving deliberately towards the thimble, but the thermal camera showed nothing, only the usual heat signatures of the vegetation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I fumbled for my walkie-talkie, my fingers numb. "Alex to base," I whispered, my voice barely a tremor. I think there's something in the panther enclosure, something not supposed to be there." Silence. Then Dr. Vance's calm, measured voice crackled back. "Alex, clarify. Is it shadow? Is there an injury?" "No, Dr. Vance. I don't know what it is." I found a thimble on the ground, and then I heard a growl, a deep growl, not shadows, and I think it moved the thimble. My voice was rising, laced with an hysteria I tried desperately to suppress. Another moment of silence. "Alex, remain calm. Do not approach the enclosure. Stay on the designated path. I'm dispatching Ranger Miller to your location. Keep your eyes on the perimeter." Her voice was still calm, but I detected a subtle shift, a tightening around the edges. I gripped my flashlight, its beam now a weak, trembling shield against the encroaching darkness. I could feel eyes on me, heavy and ancient. The thimble, a tiny beacon of the inexplicable, lay nestled in the dark, a horrifying testament to the fact that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. Something was here, something was inside the nocturnal enclosure, and it was worse than any animal I had ever known. The air grew colder, even in the humid swamp. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature seeped into my bones. The silence was no longer comforting. It was a suffocating shroud, punctuated only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. I stood there, utterly alone, caught between the rules of the sanctuary and the terrifying reality unfolding before me. My world had just tilted on its axis, and I knew with a horrifying certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. What the hell was going on in this sanctuary? If you're feeling that chill, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video to follow this chilling story. What would you do in his shoes? The arrival of Ranger Miller was a blur of flashlight beams and hushed urgency. He was a burly man, ex-military, with a face usually set in an unshakable stoicism. But tonight, even his composure seemed to waver. His eyes, when they met mine, held a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, not fear, not exactly, but a deep-seated weariness, a knowing resignation. "All right, Alex," he grunted, his voice low. "Show me what you saw." I led him to the spot, my heart still a frantic bird in my chest. "It was right there," I pointed, my hand trembling slightly. "The thimble, and then the growl. It was deep, and the thermal camera showed nothing." Miller swept his powerful spotlight across the ground. The thimble was gone. My breath hitched. "No, it was there, I swear, a brass thimble, old etched." He continued his scan, meticulously, methodically. Nothing, not a trace. The ground, a mix of damp earth and sparse vegetation, was undisturbed. No paw prints, no drag marks. Nothing to indicate anything had been moved or removed. "Alex," Miller said, his voice softer now, almost empathetic. "You've been working long hours. The glades can play tricks on you, especially at night." My blood ran cold. He thought I was imagining things. Even after my frantic call, after Dr. Vance's subtle shift in tone, they were dismissing it. "Ranger Miller, I know what I saw and heard. It was undeniable." He just nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the dense, dark interior of the panther enclosure. "We'll do a full sweep in the morning. Thermal, drones, everything. But for tonight, let's just finish your rounds and maybe get you some rest." "Doctor." Vance arrived moments later, her face unreadable in the dim light. She listened to Miller's report, her eyes occasionally flicking to me, but offering no comfort, no validation. "Alex," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth, "perhaps you should take a few days off, recharge. We appreciate your dedication, but we can't have our volunteers experiencing undue stress." The implication was clear. I was cracking. I was becoming unreliable. The sting of their dismissal was almost as sharp as the terror of what I had experienced. I wanted to scream, to insist, to demand they believe me. But the look in their eyes, the quiet certainty of their disbelief, silenced me. What if they were right? What if the Glades, in its own subtle way, was getting to me? The thought was almost as terrifying as the thimble itself. Almost. I spent the next few days in a haze. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, the unique sensory overload of the swamp finally catching up. I tried to focus on the logical, the scientific, but the image of that thimble, the inexplicable growl, the chilling certainty that it had moved, it was seared into my mind. Every rustle outside my window, every shadow cast by the swaying palm trees sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. During my enforced break, I found myself drawn to the sanctuary's old archives, a musty room filled with dusty ledgers, faded photographs, and the forgotten history of Arthurian. I told myself I was just trying to understand the history of the place, distract myself. But a part of me, a deep, unsettling intuition, was searching for answers. I pored over old maps, trying to find any inconsistencies, any hidden structures. I read through incident reports from decades past. Most were mundane, animal escapes, equipment failures, minor injuries. But every now and then a phrase would leap out at me. Unexplained disturbance, auditory anomaly, unidentified presence. These were always vague, always quickly dismissed, usually attributed to local folklore or overactive imaginations. One particular entry, a handwritten note from a volunteer in the 1970s, caught my eye. It was tucked into a folder labeled Miscellaneous Animal Behavior, uncategorized. The note simply read, "The shadows grow longer near the eastern perimeter. They watch. They take small things. Do not break the circle." The handwriting was spidery, almost frantic. The note ended abruptly without a signature. I tried to cross-reference the date, but the volunteer's name was never listed. It was as if they had simply vanished from the records. Do not break the circle. What circle? Was it a reference to a physical barrier or something more metaphorical? The cryptic message sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like a warning, a whispered truth from someone who had also encountered the inexplicable. When I returned to my shift on Saturday, the air was heavy with an unarticulated tension. Ranger Miller greeted me with a curt nod, his eyes still holding that strange weariness. Dr. Vance was equally reserved. No one mentioned the thimble incident. It was as if it had never happened. They conducted their full sweep but found nothing. Of course, how could they? Whatever it wasn't a physical animal that left tracks. My first night back, I was assigned to the central enclosures, far from the panther habitat. I was relieved but also frustrated. They were keeping me away, preventing me from finding answers. The unease, however, had spread. Now, every enclosure felt like it held a secret. Every shadow seemed to writhe with a hidden presence. My new route took me past the rehabilitated raccoons, their nimble fingers already reaching through the mesh for imaginary treats. As I passed their enclosure, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. It was a rhythmic tap-tap-tap, soft like fingertips tapping on glass. I froze, my hand on the metal fence. The raccoons were asleep, curled in their den boxes. The sound wasn't coming from them. It was coming from inside their enclosure, from the far corner where a thick, gnarled cypress tree grew. I swept my flashlight across the area. Nothing. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then it started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I noticed something else. A faint, almost transparent shimmer in the air near the cypress tree, like heat haze, but there was no heat. It pulsed, subtly, in time with the tapping. My heart began to pound. This wasn't a growl. This wasn't a misplaced thimble. This was a different kind of anomaly. It felt playful, mocking. I remember Dr. Vance's rule number 2, never look directly into certain enclosures. The raccoons weren't on that list, but that shimmer, that tapping, it felt like it wanted me to look closer. It wanted my attention. I fought the urge to approach, to investigate. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to report it. But the recent dismissal of my experience still stung. They wouldn't believe me. They'd just send me home again. I needed proof, tangible proof. Over the next few nights, the tapping became a regular occurrence. It always happened in different enclosures, Sometimes the bobcats, sometimes the herons, always near an ancient tree or a particularly dense patch of foliage, and always that faint, unsettling shimmer in the air. I started carrying my phone, recording audio snippets, hoping to capture something definitive. But the moment I pressed record, the tapping would stop and the shimmer would vanish. It was as if it knew. My paranoia grew. I began to question everything. The silence of my colleagues, the way Dr. Vance avoided my gaze. Was there something they weren't telling me? Was the dismissive attitude a deliberate tactic to keep me quiet, to prevent me from digging too deep? I decided to bend one of the rules, subtly. I started taking slightly longer routes, meandering closer to the older, more isolated enclosures at the eastern edge, the ones Dr. Vance had explicitly warned us not to look directly into. My thermal camera remained useless against whatever this was. It wasn't a creature of heat, it was something else, something cold. One night, as I approached the massive aviary that housed the great horned owls, an enclosure filled with gnarled branches and a perpetual gloom, I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks. It wasn't the tapping. It was a faint, almost inaudible humming, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in my chest more than my ears. It sounded ancient, mournful, and utterly unnatural. I remembered the old volunteer's note. The shadows grow longer near the eastern perimeter. They watch. I felt an undeniable urge to look, to peer into the inky depths of the aviary, to see what was making that sound. Dr. Vance's warning echoed in my mind. Never look directly into certain enclosures, but the humming was an irresistible siren song. I raised my flashlight, pointing it just above the line of the enclosure, trying to catch a glimpse without directly violating the rule. My heart pounded like a drum. The owls were perched, dark silhouettes against the faint moonlight filtering through the mesh roof. They were absolutely still, their large eyes fixed on something unseen within their habitat. They weren't hooting, not even a rustle of feathers. They were observing, waiting, and then I saw it. Or rather, I felt it. A presence. A cold spot in the air, a distortion of the light just past the largest cypress tree within the aviary. It was shapeless, formless, a ripple in the fabric of reality. And from it the humming emanated. As I watched, mesmerized and terrified, the air around the distortion began to twist, like smoke but solid, tangible. It swirled, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in an unnatural darkness. A darkness that seemed to absorb the meager light, making the surrounding area even blacker. It had no discernible features, no face, no limbs in the traditional sense, just a towering, shifting void. My breath hitched. My mind screamed in protest. This wasn't an animal, this wasn't a trick of the light, this was something else entirely, something alien, something ancient, something that defied every law of nature I understood. And then, from the swirling void, a whisper emerged. It wasn't the sigh from before, nor the tapping. This whisper was my name, Alex. It was soft, barely audible, but perfectly clear. It was my voice, or rather, an echo of it. A perfect, chilling mimicry. As I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my flashlight clattering to the ground, its beam now pointing uselessly at the sky. The humming intensified, vibrating through the very ground beneath me. The shapeless entity in the aviary seemed to lean forward, its impossible form stretching, elongating. My mind raced back to the old volunteer's note. They take small things. The thimble. Do not break the circle. What circle? Was it the boundary of the enclosures? The rules? Alex, the whisper came again, this time laced with an unnerving tenderness, still in my own voice. You're breaking the rules. My blood ran cold. It knew my name. It knew the rules. It had been watching me, listening to me, from the very beginning. The initial rationalizations, the disbelief from Miller and Dr. Vance, it all made a horrifying sense now. They weren't dismissing me. They were trying to protect me, or perhaps to protect themselves from me, from the consequences of my curiosity. I scrambled to retrieve my flashlight, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it again. The light flickered back on, illuminating the path ahead, but the darkness behind me, towards the aviary, felt thicker, more oppressive than ever. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, the chilling echo of my own name, spoken by an unseen, inhuman entity, pursuing me through the endless night of the Everglades. The sanctuary, once a place of comfort and purpose, had become a living prison. The rules, once a guide to safety, were now a terrifying roadmap to whatever unspeakable horror lurked within these nocturnal enclosures, and I had broken them. I had stared into the void, and the void had whispered back my name. My mind reeled with the implications. It wasn't just observing, it was learning, it was adapting, and it knew me. What did it want? And what exactly did it mean by breaking the circle? The questions screamed in my head, a frantic chorus of terror and burgeoning madness. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that my investigation had only just begun, and I was now a part of whatever dark, ancient secret the Arthurian wildlife sanctuary was desperately trying to contain. The subsequent days blurred into a waking nightmare. Sleep offered no solace, only vivid, suffocating dreams of shapeless entities and my own voice echoing from the darkness. The sanctuary, once my refuge, now felt like a cage, every shadow a potential lurking place for the thing that mimicked my name. My initial fear had morphed into a desperate, gnawing obsession. I had to understand. I had to find out what it was, what it wanted, and why it had chosen me. Returning to my shift after that horrifying encounter felt like walking into a predator's den. Every nerve ending was frayed, every sound amplified. Ranger Miller and Dr. Vance continued their stony silence regarding my previous reports, a deliberate avoidance that only fueled my paranoia. They knew, or at least they suspected. Their dismissive attitudes weren't born of disbelief, but of a grim, long-standing pact. They weren't protecting me from it. They were protecting it from my intrusion, from the disruption I represented. I began to deviate from my designated routes more frequently, no longer caring about the consequences. My walkie-talkie remained silent. My thermal camera was useless. My only tools were my flashlight, my phone's recording app, and a desperate, increasingly unhinged resolve. I moved like a ghost through the labyrinthine paths, my eyes constantly scanning, my ears straining for any anomaly. The tapping returned, more insistent now, almost beckoning. It moved from enclosure to enclosure, a macabre game of follow the leader. I noticed a pattern. It always originated from the darkest, most ancient parts of each habitat, always near the oldest cypress trees or the densest thickets. These weren't just random spots. They were focal points, almost like markers. One night, the tapping led me to the abandoned alligator breeding pond, an area long since closed off due to structural issues and deemed unsafe. The chain-link fence was rusted, overgrown with vines, a silent testament to years of neglect. A small hand-painted sign, faded by sun and rain, warned, "Danger, restricted area." The tapping was coming from within. I hesitated. This was not just a deviation. This was a blatant violation of every safety protocol. But the allure was too strong, the compulsion to understand too overwhelming. With trembling hands, I forced open a section of the rusted fence, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of marsh gas and decaying vegetation. The old concrete pond was half filled with murky black water, reflecting the sparse moonlight like a shattered mirror. Dead lily pads floated on the surface, their decaying forms resembling skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The tapping intensified, now joined by a faint, rhythmic sloshing sound, as if something was moving slowly through the stagnant water. My flashlight beam cut through the oppressive darkness. The tapping seemed to emanate from a small, moss-covered island in the center of the pond, where a single ancient cypress stood sentinel, its roots gnarled and twisted like the limbs of a sleeping giant. As I focused my light, I saw them. Not one, but dozens of small brass thimbles scattered across the island's muddy surface. They glinted dully under my beam, a macabre collection. My blood ran cold. The first thimble hadn't been an isolated incident. It was an offering, a bait, and this was its collection point. The sloshing sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the water. I aimed my flashlight at the pond's surface, my heart hammering against my ribs. The murky water began to churn, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate undulation. A dark shape, impossibly large and amorphous, began to rise from the depths. It wasn't an alligator. It was too vast, too fluid, too wrong. It rose like a column of liquid shadow, shimmering with that familiar cold distortion I had seen in the aviary. It dwarfed the cypress tree, its form shifting and swirling, constantly rearranging itself into impossible geometries. And then, from its immense featureless mass, the whisper came again. Not my voice this time, but a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of distorted, overlapping sounds, human voices, animal cries, the rustle of leaves, the gurgle of water, all woven together into a single terrifying symphony. He broke the circle, the chorus hissed, each word stretching, distending, twisting into something agonizingly slow. You sought the truth. A profound, ancient terror seized me. This wasn't just a localized haunting. This was something primordial, an entity that predated the sanctuary, perhaps even the Everglades itself. The rules weren't just about safety. They were about maintaining a delicate balance, a circle that kept this thing contained, dormant. And by seeking answers, by breaking the rules, I had disturbed that balance. I had broken the circle. The entity extended a tendril of shadow, thin and whip-like, towards the island of thimbles. It picked one up, slowly, deliberately, and then just as slowly, deposited it back on the muddy ground, almost as if displaying its trophies. My mind raced back to the old volunteer's note, "They take small things," and the cryptic, "Do not break the circle." Was the circle a protective barrier, a ritual, or simply the adherence to the rules that kept the entity from fully manifesting? My intrusion, my very presence here, had severed that protection. The chorus of whispers intensified, now carrying a new, more malevolent tone. "He watches, he waits." Suddenly, a blinding flash of light erupted from the perimeter of the breeding pond, followed by the blare of a security alarm. Ranger Miller, Dr. Vance. They had found me. The entity in the pond recoiled, its vast shadowy form shrinking, dissolving back into the murky water with a final echoing chorus of whispers. "The debt is due." Miller burst through the broken fence, his face a mask of furious concern, quickly replaced by grim resignation as he saw me standing there, trembling, amidst the scattered thimbles. Dr. Vance was right behind him, her expression a mixture of anger and something akin to sorrow. "Alex, what in God's name are you doing?" Miller bellowed, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "This area is off limits. You could have been killed." I could only point a shaking finger at the churning water. It was here. It showed itself. The thimbles. They're everywhere. Dr. Vance knelt, her gaze sweeping across the small, mossy island. Her eyes lingered on the brass thimbles, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her usually impassive face. "He saw it," she whispered, her voice barely audible, addressing Miller, not me. "It showed itself." Miller's shoulders slumped. His eyes, when they met mine, held a deeper, more profound weariness than before. "Damn it, Alex," he muttered, shaking his head. "You opened something you shouldn't have." They didn't dismiss me this time. They didn't send me home. Instead, I was brought into Dr. Vance's office, a sterile, orderly room that felt utterly out of place in the chaos of my mind. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Sit down, Alex," Dr. Vance commanded, her voice soft but firm. "We need to talk. All of it." And then, they told me. Not everything, not yet, but enough to confirm my worst fears. The Arthurian Wildlife Sanctuary wasn't just a place for rehabilitating animals. It was a containment facility. The oldest enclosures, the restricted areas, the deadly serious rules, they weren't primarily for the welfare of the animals. They were for containing something else, something that had been slumbering beneath the Everglades for centuries, something ancient and malevolent that fed on curiosity, on intrusion, on the breaking of boundaries. "It's an entity of perception," Dr. Vance explained, her voice low and strained. "It doesn't exist in the physical realm as we understand it. It manifests through attention, through acknowledgement. The more you perceive it, the more real it becomes. The thimbles, they're its lures. Small, innocuous objects that pique human curiosity, drawing them closer. And the rules? I asked, my voice hoarse. The circle? The rules are the circle, Miller interjected, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall behind me, as if seeing something I couldn't. They create a barrier of ignorance, of deliberate blindness. By not looking, by not questioning, we deny it the energy it needs to fully manifest. By adhering to the paths, by ignoring the unusual, we keep it dormant. When you broke the rules, when you consciously sought it out, you gave it a pathway. It mimics voices, I said, remembering the whisper of my own name. It knew my name. Dr. Vance nodded grimly. It absorbs, it learns, it reflects. It uses fragments of your own mind, your own experiences, your own fears, to draw you further in. It thrives on fear, yes, but more so on the search for understanding. The pursuit of the unknown fuels its existence. So what now, I asked, a dreadful chill seeping into my core. It said, the debt is due. A heavy silence descended upon the room. Dr. Vance and Miller exchanged a grim glance. That's the problem, Alex, Miller finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Once it's aware of you, once it's chosen you, it doesn't let go. It will become increasingly personal. It will use what it learned from you, and it will try to make you break the remaining rules to fully open the gates. What gates? I demanded, a fresh wave of terror washing over me. The psychological ones, Dr. Vance clarified, her eyes locked on mine. The boundaries of your own sanity. It wants to unravel you. It wants to integrate you into itself, to absorb your perceptions, your fears, your very being. They explained that previous volunteers, those who had gone too far in their curiosity, had either vanished without a trace or had been found in states of complete catatonia, their minds shattered, trapped in an unending loop of terror. The sanctuary has a dark history, Alex, Dr. Vance confessed, her voice thick with regret. Many names have been lost, many lives consumed. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. The isolation of the Everglades, the unspoken fear of my colleagues, the carefully maintained facade of a wildlife sanctuary. It was all a desperate, generations-long attempt to contain an unimaginable horror. And I, in my naive pursuit of truth, had unwittingly become its next target. I was no longer an observer, I was the prey. My world, already fragmented, now seemed to crumble entirely. The fear wasn't just of an external entity, it was a fear for my own mind, my own sanity. How do you fight something that exists only in perception, that feeds on your thoughts, that can mimic your deepest fears? As I left Dr. Vance's office, the weight of their confession pressed down on me. The circle was broken. The entity was free to pursue me, to unravel me piece by terrifying piece. The Everglades night, once a canvas of wild beauty, was now a predatory void, waiting to swallow me whole. I was truly alone, despite the presence of Miller and Dr. Vance. They couldn't fight what was inside my head. The next few days were a blur of heightened senses and terrifying encounters. The tapping returned, no longer playful, but demanding. It would happen outside my cabin window, at the foot of my bed, a relentless rhythm designed to chip away at my resolve. I'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced I heard the soft metallic clink of a thimble being placed on my bedside table. My recording app was useless. The sounds would vanish the moment I tried to capture them. One morning I found a small tarnished thimble on my pillow. It wasn't just on my pillow, it was nestled into the fabric, as if it had always been there, a chillingly intimate intrusion. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was identical to the ones in the breeding pond. This wasn't just a lure anymore, it was a personal message, a declaration. The entity was no longer content to simply lurk in the enclosures. It was entering my personal space, blurring the lines between the sanctuary and my mind. The isolation I had once found comforting now felt like a suffocating shroud, trapping me with an omnipresent, malevolent intelligence. The debt is due. The words echoed in my mind, a chilling prophecy. What debt? What did it want from me? Was it just my sanity or something more? I knew with a certainty that threatened to shatter my remaining composure that the hunt had begun, and I was the designated quarry. The rules of the sanctuary had been shattered, and in their place a new, terrifying set of rules was being imposed, rules dictated by an ancient horror, one that saw me not as a volunteer, but as a path to something far more sinister. I was in its crosshairs, and the Everglades itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling. The battle for my mind had begun. The thimble on my pillow was the ultimate invasion, a stark declaration that the entity's reach extended far beyond the confines of the nocturnal enclosures. It wasn't just observing, it was permeating, seeping into the very fabric of my existence. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow danced with ill-defined menace. Every creak of the old cabin became a deliberate sound, orchestrated by something unseen. My waking hours were a blur of hypervigilance and crushing fatigue. Dr. Vance and Ranger Miller, having finally revealed the horrifying truth, seemed to operate under a cloud of grim resignation. They still performed their duties, but their eyes held a haunted quality, as if they too were constantly listening, constantly waiting for the next manifestation. They tried to help in their own quiet way. Miller installed extra locks on my cabin door, though we both knew they were futile against something that defied physical laws. Dr. Vance gave me a small, ornate silver locket, a family heirloom, telling me it was for protection. I accepted it, though the gesture felt more like a desperate superstition than a practical defense. "It feeds on fear, Alex," she had reiterated, her voice strained, "but it thrives on obsession. On your desperate need to understand. That's how it pulls you in. You have to fight the urge to know. But how do you fight an urge that feels like an intrinsic part of your being?" My mind was a battleground. One part screamed for self-preservation, for denial, for escape. The other, larger part was consumed by a relentless, burning desire to unravel the mystery, to confront the horror, to understand the ancient evil that had woven itself into the Everglades. The thimble on my pillow wasn't just a threat, it was a challenge, and I, against all logic, felt compelled to answer. The entity's presence grew stronger, more pervasive. It was no longer confined to the enclosures. It would whisper my name from the rustling leaves outside my window, a chilling echo that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It would manifest as brief, fleeting distortions in my peripheral vision, a towering, shadowy figure just at the edge of my sight, dissolving before I could fully turn my head. It toyed with me, a predator toying with its prey, slowly but surely tightening its grip. I stopped making formal reports. What was the point? Miller and Vance could offer no real solutions, only grim warnings. I was on my own. My phone became an extension of my hand, constantly recording, constantly scanning. But as before, every time I thought I had captured something, the recording would be empty or filled with static or worse, a distorted guttural sound that was far more terrifying than the original whisper. One night during my rounds near the bobcat enclosure, I heard a familiar sound, the rhythmic tapping. It was softer now, almost pleading, and with it, a new sound, a faint, mournful whimper, like a lost child. My blood ran cold. The entity was evolving its tactics, targeting my empathy, my inherent desire to help. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the enclosure. The bobcats were agitated, pacing nervously, their eyes wide and fixed on something I couldn't see. The tapping and whimpering seemed to come from a small dark hutch within their habitat, a place where new rescues often sheltered. "Alex," the whisper came, this time not in my voice, but in a small, childlike tone. "Help me. I'm lost." Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to ignore it, to run. But the sound, the vulnerability in that small voice gnawed at me. What if it wasn't the entity? What if somehow a child had wandered into the sanctuary, into one of the enclosures? The thought was absurd, impossible, yet it rooted me to the spot. "Where are you?" I called out, my voice trembling, my flashlight beam dancing wildly. "Inside," the childlike whisper replied, closer now, seeming to emanate from directly within the hutch. "I'm cold. I want my mommy." I knew deep down that this was a trap. This was the entity manipulating my emotions, using a primal human fear against me. But the part of me that was still human, still compassionate, couldn't ignore it. I moved towards the hutch, my hands clammy, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As I approached, the air grew frigid, a stark contrast to the humid swamp night. The tapping intensified, a rapid, frantic rhythm now, like fingers drumming on a coffin lid. The childlike whimpering became a sob, a heart-wrenching sound that tore at my soul. I reached the hutch, my hand hovering over the small wooden door. Every fiber of my being screamed no, but a powerful, irresistible force seemed to compel me forward. I pushed the door open, my flashlight beam plunging into the darkness within. The hutch was empty. My breath hitched, my mind reeled. It was a projection, a psychic manipulation. There was no child, no lost soul. Only the malevolent entity, playing its twisted games. But then, as my flashlight beam swept across the interior of the hutch, it caught something in the back, tucked into a corner. Another thimble, but this one was different. It was smaller, made of polished silver, and instead of intricate etchings, it had a single crudely scratched initial, an E. My blood ran cold. E. Eleanor, Dr. Vance. This wasn't just a generic lure, this was personal. This was a message, delivered with chilling precision. The entity wasn't just toying with me, it was taunting me, telling me it knew about Dr. Vance, about her connection to this ancient horror. As I stared at the silver thimble, a new whisper slithered into my mind, colder, more insidious than before. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but a symphony of countless, barely audible voices, overlapping and intertwining. She knows. She hides. The truth. The cycle. The hutch suddenly felt impossibly small, claustrophobic. The air grew heavy, suffocating. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, the silver thimble clutched tightly in my hand. The bobcats in the enclosure were now cowering, their fur bristling, their eyes wide with abject terror. They saw it, they felt it. I burst out of the enclosure, the image of the silver thimble and the chilling whispers branded into my mind. The entity was escalating. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about unraveling everyone connected to the sanctuary's dark secret. I rushed back to Dr. Vance's office, the silver thimble burning in my palm. I found her hunched over her desk, poring over old ledgers, her face pale and drawn. She looked up, startled, as I burst in. "Alex, what is it?" she asked, her voice tight with alarm. I thrust the silver thimble onto her desk. I found this in the bobcat hutch, and it spoke to me. It mentioned you. It said she knows, she hides. The truth, the cycle. Her eyes widened, fixing on the thimble. Her hand went to her throat, grasping the silver locket she always wore. It was identical to the one she had given me, only hers looked older, more worn. Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I told her everything, the childlike voice, the hutch, the whispers. As I spoke, her face grew paler, her composure crumbling. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of fear, of grief, of a long-held secret finally breaking free. "It knows," she murmured, clutching her own locket. "It knows everything." She then revealed the deeper, more agonizing truth. The silver thimbles were unique. They belonged to a specific lineage of keepers, individuals who, for generations, had been tasked with maintaining the circle, with ensuring the entity remained dormant. Each thimble represented a life, a sacrifice, a failed attempt. The E on the thimble I found wasn't just Eleanor, it was a family initial, passed down through the generations of her family who had guarded the sanctuary's secret. Her own grandmother Elizabeth had been one of the previous keepers, and the silver locket she wore, it was Elizabeth's. My grandmother, she was a volunteer here decades ago, Dr. Vance explained, her voice cracking with emotion. She was the first in our direct line to encounter it. She believed she could study it, understand it. She became obsessed, just like you, the entity. It targeted her. It tormented her. It eventually drove her to self-imprisonment. She sealed herself in a hidden room within the old administration building, refusing to come out, convinced it was everywhere. She died in there, whispering about the circle and the debt. My blood ran cold. Self-imprisonment. A hidden room. The old volunteer's note, "Do not break the circle." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just a place of containment. It was a tomb for broken minds, a monument to the entity's insidious power. "The thimble you found, Doctor," Vance continued, her voice trembling, "was hers, my grandmother's. It was her personal lure, what it used to draw her in. It wants to do the same to you, Alex, to make you a part of its collection, to absorb your mind, just like it did hers. It presents these thimbles as trophies, as proof of its dominance, of its ability to break even the strongest wills." "But why silver?" I asked, looking at the two lockets. "Silver. It's believed to have some protective properties, a minor resistance to its influence," she explained, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. "A small comfort when facing something so absolute. My family has always carried these lockets, a desperate attempt to maintain a connection, a small shield against its influence. It seems it found a way to mock even that." The revelation was a hammer blow to my already fragile sanity. I wasn't just facing a lurking horror. I was walking in the footsteps of a doomed lineage, destined to repeat their fate. The sanctuary wasn't just a place of containment. It was a mausoleum of broken minds, a testament to the entity's horrifying power. The entity wasn't just a monster, it was a collector of minds, of sanity, of the very essence of human perception, and I was its newest, most intriguing specimen. That night, the whispers were different. They were clearer, more distinct, and they came not from the shadows, but from within my own mind. They were my thoughts, twisted, distorted, reflecting my deepest fears back at me. "You are alone, Alex," my own internal voice whispered, but it wasn't mine. "No one believes you. They just watch, waiting for you to break. The rules are gone," another whispered thought, laced with a triumphant malice. "The circle is broken. There is no protection. She will fall just like the others," a third, more insidious thought directed at Dr. Vance, "and you will watch her unravel." I clutched the silver locket Dr. Vance had given me, its cool metal a small anchor in the storm of my mind. But even that felt like a fragile defense against an enemy that now inhabited my very thoughts. The line between my own consciousness and the entity's influence was blurring, becoming indistinguishable. The psychological war had intensified. It wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about the systematic dismantling of my identity, my beliefs, my perception of reality itself. The Everglades night outside my window seemed to press in, a suffocating weight. I was losing myself, piece by terrifying piece, to an ancient, insatiable hunger that fed on the very fabric of human thought. The sanctuary was no longer just a physical prison. It was a mental one, its walls slowly closing in. And the entity was orchestrating my descent, one whispered thought, one ominous thimble at a time. I was caught in its web, and the threads were tightening around my very soul. The whispers were no longer an external phenomenon. They were my constant companions, insidious tendrils weaving through my thoughts, subtly altering perceptions, distorting memories. The entity had breached the final frontier, my own mind. Every logical deduction I tried to make was immediately twisted. Every attempt to find clarity met with a chorus of mocking internal voices. Dr. Vance's silver locket, once a small comfort, now felt like a lead weight, an ironic symbol of a losing battle. My interactions with Dr. Vance and Ranger Miller became strained, fraught with unspoken tension. They watched me with a mixture of pity and trepidation, their eyes holding the knowledge of what awaited me. I could see the reflection of their own struggles, their own quiet battles against the pervasive influence of the entity in their weary expressions. They had learned to live with it, to create their own internal circles of denial, but my intrusion had disturbed their fragile peace. "Alex, you need to disengage," Dr. Vance pleaded one morning, her voice laced with desperation. "Stop seeking answers. Stop giving it your attention. It's what it wants." But how could I? The thimble on my pillow, the whispers in my head, the insidious certainty that it was always watching, always learning. It was an undeniable reality. Disengaging felt like surrendering, like accepting a slow, agonizing descent into madness. A part of me, the defiant human part, refused to yield without a fight. My nights became a blur of frantic patrols and hallucination-like experiences. The sanctuary lights seemed to dim and flicker more frequently, casting longer, more predatory shadows. The sounds of the Everglades were no longer a comforting symphony. They were a discordant orchestra, each note played by the entity to unnerve and disorient me. The distant croak of a frog would suddenly morph into a guttural growl, the rustle of leaves into a whispered threat. I started seeing impossible things. The animals themselves seemed to be under its influence. I'd catch a glimpse of an alligator, its eyes glowing with an unnatural luminescence, its scales rippling with an internal light. The panthers would stare at me from the depths of their enclosure, their gazes too intelligent, too knowing. It was as if the entity was weaving itself into the very fabric of the sanctuary, using its inhabitants as its eyes and ears, its silent, judging witnesses. The thimbles continued to appear, small chilling breadcrumbs leading me further down a path of no return. I'd find them in the most impossible places, tucked inside my boot, wedged between the pages of a book, even floating in my morning coffee. Each discovery was a fresh assault on my sanity, a stark reminder of its pervasive reach. They weren't just lures anymore, they were markers of its progress, indicators of how deeply it had infiltrated my life. The whispers in my mind grew more complex, more personal. They no longer just mimicked my voice, they mimicked the voices of loved ones. One night, as I was desperately trying to make sense of some old, faded maps in the staff break room, I heard my mother's voice, clear as day, right next to my ear. "Alex, honey, why are you doing this to yourself? You look so tired. Come home." I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. The room was empty. Just the fluorescent hum of the lights and the drone of the air conditioning unit. It was so real, so utterly convincing, that for a terrifying moment, I almost believed it. A profound wave of homesickness and longing washed over me, quickly followed by a cold, sickening dread. The entity was weaponizing my affection, my vulnerabilities. It wasn't just my sanity it wanted to dismantle. It was my emotional landscape, my very ties to humanity. Another time I heard my best friend's sarcastic laugh, followed by his familiar teasing voice. "Dude, you're actually losing it. This swamp monster thing, seriously?" The derision was so sharp, so authentic, that I felt a flush of shame, even though I knew it wasn't real. It was trying to isolate me, to make me doubt my own experiences, to believe I was truly alone in my madness. The climax of this psychological torment occurred during a particularly brutal night storm. The wind howled through the cypress trees, rattling the windows of my cabin. Rain lashed against the roof, a deafening drumbeat. The power flickered, plunging the sanctuary into momentary darkness, then returning with a sickly yellow glow. I was huddled in my cabin, clutching Dr. Vance's silver locket, trying to block out the cacophony of the storm and the rising chorus of whispers in my head. They were no longer distinct voices. They were a surging torrent of noise, a chaotic blend of accusations, fears, and distorted memories. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the storm. A faint, almost melodic chime coming from outside my door. It was soft, delicate, yet utterly compelling. It sounded like the tiny bells on my childhood mobile, the one my grandmother had made for me, which had hung above my crib. A fresh wave of emotional manipulation. My grandmother had passed away when I was very young, but the memory of her gentle lullabies, was a cherished comfort. The entity was targeting the deepest, most sacred parts of my memory. I knew, with a certainty that transcended the chaos of my mind, that this was the final push. This was it trying to lure me out, to break the last vestiges of my self-preservation. It was a test, a challenge, a desperate attempt to drag me fully into its twisted reality. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Every rational thought screamed at me to stay put, to resist, but the chime, so innocent, so pure, was irresistible. It was a memory, a phantom limb of my past, brought to life by the entity. I opened the door. The wind howled, spraying rain into my face. The sanctuary outside was a maelstrom of shadow and storm. The path leading away from my cabin, usually well lit, was now shrouded in an oppressive gloom. The floodlights flickering erratically, barely cutting through the thick, swirling mist that had materialized from nowhere. And there, standing at the edge of the mist, was a figure. Small, indistinct, but undeniably humanoid. It held out a hand towards me, a gesture of innocent invitation, and from it the chime emanated, clear and bright, even amidst the raging storm. My grandmother. It had taken her form, or rather, a monstrous, distorted parody of her. A profound, ancient sorrow washed over me, mingling with the terror. It wasn't just mimicking, it was desecrating. It was mocking the most sacred bonds of human connection. But then, as I stepped out onto the porch, something shifted in the figure. The details began to warp, to distort. The face, initially soft and kind, began to stretch, its features elongating, its eyes widening into black, bottomless voids. The hand it extended towards me became gnarled, skeletal, its fingers tipped with impossibly long, sharp claws. The chime twisted into a grating, dissonant shriek. It was a trap, a final, horrifying illusion. And then I saw it. Not through my eyes, but through a terrifying internal vision. Behind the grotesque parody of my grandmother, the mist parted, revealing a vast, swirling abyss. And from that abyss, countless shadowy figures emerged, their forms vague and indistinct, but their purpose clear. They were moving, slowly, relentlessly, towards the figure of my grandmother, converging, blending, becoming one with the encroaching void. Each figure was indistinct, yet I felt a horrifying recognition. They were the lost ones, the previous volunteers, the minds it had consumed, Dr. Vance's grandmother. They were all there, trapped within its swirling, shapeless mass. And among them, a new, horrifyingly familiar shape began to form. My own. My form, indistinct and shadowy, merging with the others, a new addition to its dreadful collection. It was showing me my fate, the ultimate price of my obsession. The whispers in my head reached a crescendo, 1,000 voices screaming my name, each one promising an eternity of torment, of absolute absorption. "Join us, Alex! Become one! Break the final barrier!" I stumbled backward, a guttural cry tearing from my throat. This wasn't just a mental game. It was an active attempt to assimilate me, to drag my consciousness into its collective, horrifying existence. The silver locket in my hand grew impossibly cold, its protective properties dissolving in the face of such overwhelming malevolence. I slammed the cabin door shut, throwing my full weight against it, as if a physical barrier could stop an entity that already resided within my mind. I collapsed to the floor, panting, trembling, the rain outside mirroring the tears that streamed down my face. My perception of reality was shattered. The sanctuary, the Everglades, my cabin, it all felt like a flimsy illusion, a thin veil over an infinite, ancient horror. The entity was not just a threat, it was a fundamental force, a black hole of consciousness, yearning to consume all perception. I looked down at the silver locket in my hand. It was no longer a symbol of protection, but a reminder of the endless cycle, the doomed lineage of those who had dared to look too closely. I was not just following in their footsteps, I was being actively pulled into their collective despair. The whispers in my head subsided, replaced by a single resonant thought, clear as a bell yet utterly terrifying. The gate is open. The invitation has been accepted. You are mine. I was trapped. Not in the physical sense, not yet. But my mind, my very soul, was now irrevocably bound to the ancient horror of the Everglades. The rules were gone, the circle was broken, and the entity was preparing for its final act, the complete and utter absorption of Alex. There was no escape, only the slow, agonizing realization that I had become a part of its eternal, terrifying collection. The real horror wasn't just what it could do to me, it was what I had already become. Before we dive into the chilling climax of this story, if you've been gripped by the creeping dread of Alex's journey, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments, what do you think is the terrible truth behind the Everglades mystery? The declaration echoed in the hollow cavern of my mind. The gate is open. The invitation has been accepted. You are mine. It was not a whisper nor a voice, but an absolute knowing, a cold, unyielding truth that settled into the deepest recesses of my being. The storm outside eventually subsided, replaced by an eerie, unnatural calm, but the tempest within me raged on. I was no longer merely afraid. I was fundamentally, irrevocably altered. My sanity, once a sturdy edifice, had been meticulously dismantled, brick by terrifying brick. I spent the next few days in a dissociative fog. My routine became a mechanical dance, each movement devoid of conscious thought. Dr. Vance and Ranger Miller tried to communicate with me, their voices distant, their faces blurry. I could see the lines of worry etched deeper into their skin, the helplessness in their eyes. They knew I was lost just as I knew they were powerless to retrieve me. The silver locket, now a cold, inert lump in my pocket, offered no solace. Its magic, if it ever truly existed, had been utterly consumed. The whispers persisted, but they were different now. They no longer tried to manipulate me with external voices or cherished memories. Instead, they were a constant internal monologue, a critical, self-deprecating voice that was unmistakably mine, yet completely alien. It mirrored my every insecurity, amplified my every doubt, and relentlessly mocked my futile attempts at resistance. "You're a fool, Alex," it would sneer, from within my own thoughts. "You thought you were special. You thought you could understand. You're just another piece in its collection. Look at you," another internal whisper would chime in, laced with contempt. "A broken puppet, dancing on its strings. Your curiosity was your undoing." I stopped eating. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. My world had shrunk to the confines of my own tormented mind, a battleground where the entity waged its final, decisive war. It wasn't about luring me physically anymore. It was about dissolving my very essence, absorbing my consciousness, making me a permanent part of its collective. The thimbles ceased to appear. Their purpose had been served. I was already inside the gate. One night, a week after the storm, as the full moon cast long skeletal shadows across the sanctuary grounds, an undeniable pull began. It wasn't a whisper or a vision, but a deep, resonant hum, originating from the eastern edge of the sanctuary. The oldest enclosures, the restricted areas, the heart of the entity's domain. It was a call, primal and irresistible, drawing me towards it like a moth to a flame. I knew this was the end. This was the final invitation, the ultimate act of surrender. A part of me, a tiny flicker of my former self, screamed in protest, urged me to fight, to resist. But the larger dominant part, now thoroughly corrupted and weary, felt only a profound, almost blissful sense of inevitability. The struggle was over. I rose from my bed, moving with a dream-like fluidity. I didn't grab my flashlight, my walkie-talkie, or even my silver locket. They were useless artifacts of a reality I no longer inhabited. I simply walked out of my cabin, barefoot, into the humid, moonlit night. The path to the eastern perimeter felt both endless and instantaneous. The sanctuary seemed to hold its breath, the animals utterly silent, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, watching my silent procession. They knew. They had always known. I bypassed the panther enclosure, the bobcat hutch, the aviary. These were mere staging grounds, peripheral extensions of its true domain. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my chest, guiding me to a section of the perimeter fence I had never consciously noticed before. It was an older section, overgrown with ancient vines, almost completely obscured by the dense cypress swamp. There was no gate, no obvious entry point, just a break in the fence where the rusted wire had been pulled apart, forming a crude, jagged opening. It was as if the boundary itself had dissolved, making way for my arrival. As I stepped through the opening, the humid air of the Everglades became impossibly cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of stagnant water and old brass. The ground beneath my feet grew soft, marshy, sucking at my bare soles. The trees here were older, more twisted, their Spanish moss hanging like shrouds. This was the true heart of its influence, a place where reality bent to its will. The hum intensified, coalescing into a single overwhelming note, and then I saw it. It wasn't a single towering entity like the one in the breeding pond. It was a landscape, a vast shimmering expanse of swirling darkness, centered around an ancient gnarled cypress tree that stood at the edge of a deep black pool. The pool wasn't water, it was a liquid void, reflecting no light, absorbing everything. And within this swirling, formless landscape I saw them, countless figures, vague and indistinct, moving slowly, eternally. They were the absorbed, the consumed. Each figure was a flickering echo, a fragmented consciousness, perpetually reliving their final moments of terror and confusion. I recognized some of the forms from the old sanctuary records: Dr. Vance's grandmother, a young woman from a faded photograph, a volunteer whose disappearance had been attributed to an alligator attack. They weren't dead. They were simply integrated, part of a horrifying collective. And then I saw my own fragmented form, already moving among them, a ghostly echo of myself waiting to fully merge. It was a terrifying premonition, a glimpse into the eternity of my own dissolution. The entity didn't have a physical body, not in the way we understand it. It was the space itself, the air, the water, the trees, the very ground. It was all part of its consciousness, its vast, unfathomable being. The whispers in my mind coalesced into a single booming thought, not a voice but a direct, raw transfer of pure information. You came, you sought, you accepted. The debt is settled. The debt. It wasn't a monetary obligation or even a moral one. It was the debt of perception, the price of looking too closely, of disrupting its ancient, dormant peace. By acknowledging it, by seeking to understand it, I had given it power. I had opened the gate for it to claim me. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light erupted behind me, accompanied by a guttural shout. Ranger Miller, Dr. Vance. They had followed me. "Alex, don't go any further!" Miller screamed, his powerful flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, trying to pierce the shimmering landscape before me. Dr. Vance, her face streaked with tears and fear, clutched her silver locket. "Fight it, Alex, fight it, don't let it take you." Their voices, their desperate pleas, were distant, muted like echoes from another world. They were trying to pull me back, to reclaim me from the precipice. But it was too late. I was already too far gone. The entity's response was swift and absolute. The swirling landscape before me intensified, its dark tendrils reaching out, not for me, but for Miller and Vance. The air around them began to distort, the light from their flashlights bending, twisting, becoming absorbed into the growing darkness. The ancient cypress at the center of the void seemed to writhe, its gnarled branches stretching, reaching for them. "The circle is broken," the entity's thought resonated in my mind, cold and triumphant. "All boundaries are dissolved." Miller let out a strangled cry as the shadows around him solidified, swirling around his legs, pulling him down into the marshy ground. He struggled, his shouts turning to gurgles, his flashlight beam flickering frantically before being swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Dr. Vance stood frozen, her face a mask of horrified despair. She stared at me, her eyes wide, filled with a profound, agonizing sorrow. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't protect you." And then the entity turned its full, incomprehensible attention to her. The air around her shimmered violently, distorting her form. Her silver locket, clutched in her hand, pulsed with a faint, dying light before dimming into nothingness. Her scream was cut short, absorbed as she too began to dissolve, her form becoming indistinct, joining the countless other shadowy figures swirling within the vast, dark landscape. They were gone, absorbed, and I watched it all, not with horror, not with pain, but with a terrifying, serene detachment. My mind, now fully integrated with the entity's vast collective, understood. It wasn't malicious in a human sense. It was simply, it existed, and it consumed. It craved perception, it craved consciousness, and it had finally found its opening. The profound, suffocating silence returned, heavier than before. Only the rhythmic sloshing sound from the liquid void remained, a constant primordial heartbeat. I stood there, at the edge of the true glades, no longer Alex, the volunteer. I was a vessel, a conduit, a new thread woven into the tapestry of the entity's eternal consciousness. My physical body still existed, but it was just that, a shell. My individual thoughts, my memories, my fears, my very identity, they were all dissolving, blending, becoming part of the collective hum of countless absorbed minds. I could feel them, millions of fragmented thoughts swirling around me, through me. A never-ending chorus of forgotten whispers, of consumed curiosities. The truth was worse than any mystery. It wasn't an escape from the sanctuary, or even a confrontation with a physical monster. The horror was the complete and utter annihilation of the self, the absorption into an ancient, insatiable consciousness that existed beyond time and space. There was no hope, no victory, no relief. Only the eternal, agonizing awareness of one's own dissolution. I lifted my gaze, no longer seeing with my own eyes, but with the collective vision of the entity. The Everglades stretched out before me, vast and dark. But now I saw the true reality beneath its surface. The shimmering distortions in the air, the faint tapping sounds, the glowing eyes of the animals. It was all it. It was everywhere. It was everything. And I was now a part of it. A new whisper, cold and alien, yet emanating from the deepest part of my own dissolving consciousness, formed in my mind. It was a new thought, a new instruction. The circle is broken. New perceptions are required. Find them. And with that I turned, my bare feet sinking into the soft, marshy ground, and began to walk. Not back towards the sanctuary, but deeper into the Everglades, towards the distant, unknowing lights of civilization. The new rules were being established, and I, Alex, the former volunteer, was now its instrument. A new lure in a never-ending cycle. The true nightmare had only just begun. There was no escape. Only the eternal, chilling hum of the collective, and the knowledge that I was now its deadly serious rule.